After 24 hours of talks at the Major Economies Forum, the US climate negotiator Todd Stern said tonight he thinks there is a deal to be done and that it can be done. But outside of these cosy talks, there are still plenty of people who see America as the main obstacle to a deal at Copenhagen. And when I asked him what he can do to persuade the world to sign up, he seemed to suggest it's what individual countries do that matters most.
97% of the growth of emissions between now and 2030 is going to come in the developing world. By 2030, there's going to be something like 2/3 of all global emissions coming from developing countries. So it's fine to focus on the United States. I have no problem with people focusing on the United States and wanting to hold the United States to a high standard. But if we're going to get where we're going to go, the United States has to act, and the EU, and Japan, but also the major developing countries. It's the only way to solve this problem.
I think the US administration and the US negotiating team is trying to not dampen expectations, but rather introduce a certain amount of realism about what can be expected from the US. And of course, it's also a negotiating tactic. We're just under 2 months to go. No one expects any great breakthroughs until Copenhagen, till the last few days of Copenhagen. So people are still jockeying for position of it.
The Americans have a real problem. For a meaningful deal at Copenhagen, they need to put numbers on their cuts in emissions. But legislation to do that looks unlikely to pass through the Senate in time. Now, some see that as a big enough problem that perhaps the Copenhagen talks should start, get as far as they can, and then adjourn to, say, Easter 2010, when America may have passed its climate legislation. But for politicians to save face after that would be pretty hard going. Today, at least in public, the politicians are setting themselves firmly against any talk of a so-called Plan B. It's Copenhagen or bust. But they concede there's a long way to go, and getting China and the US to recognise what each other is doing is seen as crucial to making the whole process work. The goal of Copenhagen is to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels to avoid dangerous climate change. America has talked about cuts in emissions in a range from 14 to 20%, following a path down to about an 80% cut by 2050. Crucially, it's measuring cuts against 2005 levels, not the usual 1990 baseline, so they represent less than they promise. And there's no clear timetable on the way, such as a 2020 target. China has pledged to do more than many realise. It aims to reduce the energy it uses per unit of GDP by 20% from 2005 levels by 2010. It has targets for renewable energy of 10% by 2010 and 15% by 2020, and higher vehicle fuel economy standards than most US states. Ever since Kyoto, the bargain between the rich North and the poor South has been that developing countries needn't cut their emissions while they start to grow. But Copenhagen is seen as the time when rapidly developing countries such as China need to set a date for when they will make real cuts in emissions. And that matters because the American team need that to persuade policymakers at home to take Copenhagen seriously.
Clearly, the US and China acting together on climate change will be very important. I do think that the Chinese respect the authority of the UN process and will not seek to undermine that, and therefore the nature of the deal will be supportive of an agreement coming out of Copenhagen, but they will also be about the kind of technology transfer aspects, many issues which I think American business will be particularly well placed, given the engagement from the President, to benefit from.
Tonight, the UK's Energy and Climate Change Secretary, Ed Miliband, was trying to sound optimistic.
We know it's an uphill battle to get an agreement in December, but I feel after 24 hours of meetings that it's more doable today than it was yesterday.
But with the small matter of substantial sums of money for developing countries to sort out and all the emissions numbers to pin down, it's whether the deal can become not just doable, but done by December.
Well, we're joined now from Washington by Floyd Deschamps, who advised the failed presidential candidate John McCain on climate change and also authored Senator McCain's bipartisan global warming legislation. And we're joined from Beijing by Changhua Wu, the China director of the Climate Change Group, which campaigns for solutions to global warming. Here in the studio, the Energy and Climate Change Secretary, Ed Miliband. So you spent 2 days with these guys. Did you feel you made any progress?
I felt we did make progress. The part of the purpose of this meeting was to narrow down some of the differences. And one of the things where we made progress was the sense that not only does everyone need to make commitments, but everyone needs to be transparent about them and they need to be part of an agreement. Now, that may not sound much, but actually part of the history we've had in this area is people saying it's not my responsibility, it's your responsibility. So the fact that everyone says both we will make commitments and we will make them part of an agreement and they'll be transparent and clear for everyone to see is progress. And also the spirit was we've got to get this thing done, which is very important.
Floyd Deschamps, any agreement's going to be meaningless without some sort of figures attached to it. Will there be figures forthcoming from the United States, do you think?
Well, we certainly hope so. I think a key part of what the U.S. enters into the discussion in Copenhagen with is predicated on what happens in the U.S. Congress. Of course, the House has acted. The Senate is in the process of acting, but we hope that they will have some indication going into the Copenhagen discussion as to what levels may be acceptable for the U.S. as far as any future ratification of a treaty.
Changhua Wu, what's the feeling where you are as to whether there will be any kind of meaningful deal done?
I think the overall feeling now is difficult. And if you look at the Bangkok negotiation and the public opinion here overall in China brought back, particularly influenced by the media at this moment, is not promising at all. The biggest barrier from where I stand is the developed countries. They are not really making seriously commitment as they should. Rather, they are pointing fingers to countries like China, which is very important, but really not the key actually in the Copenhagen process, because China continues to be a developing country. That's really unfortunate.
Are you saying that the Chinese will require that the developed countries make some sort of financial contribution towards China?
Not necessarily to China. I think the international opinion or debate around the Copenhagen has been sort of misleading because people tend to shift the attention to U.S. and China, even U.S., China, or EU. Actually, this is a global deal. There are more than 180 countries in there. So it's not China is speaking not only for the sake or for the benefit of China, but overall for the developing country. So I would rather see a dramatic shift of the discussion here worldwide. So based on that, then let's go back to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and going back to Kyoto Protocol. And let's follow the Bali Action Plan. We said we're going to do certain things. We're going to make commitment into that process in Copenhagen. Let's do it. And for countries like China, India, we're doing that now, but we're not really seeing dramatic progress or delivering or seriousness from delivering the commitment from the developed countries at this moment. That's really unfortunate.
Floyd Deschamps, talking realpolitik, is there any chance of the United States agreeing to any of those demands?
Well, I think the key for the U.S., as has been in the past, is that when we reach an agreement, we want to see that the world is engaged on this topic. And of course, she's right, a lot of discussion has been placed around the China-U.S. relations, but I think we're at the point now where we have to really look at this from an international perspective, including all countries and their contributions to the global emissions. But I think if we work towards that goal, we can get something done in Copenhagen.
The phrase is being used today, Ed Miliband, there's a plan A, there is no plan B. In the light of comments like that and disagreements as profound as that, there ought to be a plan B, shouldn't there?
No, I don't think there should, because actually the deadline of December has concentrated minds. China, for example, the president of China went to the UN in September and announced a change in Chinese policy. He wasn't saying it's someone else's fault. He was saying we want to act. And as you know, as a journalist, deadlines concentrate minds, and it has concentrated minds here. And I think if we really show that we are determined to drive forward to December, I think we can get a very decent deal.
Have you heard a date from the Chinese as to the time by which they will have achieved a cut?
Not to reduce their emissions.
Yeah.
Not from the Chinese government, no. From scientific bodies and others, 2030 is talked about. actually, before 2020, China doesn't need to do that. Chinese emissions, it's important to say this, are about 5 tonnes per person, still half those of the UK. So eventually they will need to cut, but not in the period we're talking about to 2020, which is the deal.